So my name is Dave, and I've been leading this walk for about 21 years. I want to record myself because I won't always be around. And I want this walk to go on for another 70 years or so, maybe on YouTube or whatever the new technology is at that time. This walk is about social movements, which the simplest definition of a social movement is a large number of people working together to resist or fix a challenge of the day. And an example of that would be here in San Francisco today. There's many challenges, but the most obvious one really for the population is how to afford to live here. A one-bedroom apartment averages over $3,000 a month, so with an average income of about $57,000, that's out of bounds for about 70% of the population as it turns out here. We'll be looking at social movements from the economic point of view, and I'm going to divide the social movements we look at into 4 categories chiefly. One will be in how to respond to the problem of the wealth divide, is the specific challenge we're looking at, into acts of charity, to idealistic attempts by a small community to not try to change society but to live within its own experience in a satisfactory way, and then more socialistic, I guess you could say, traditional attempts by groups of people to change society at large. And so again, I use the word socialistic, more social in nature and scope. And then this San Francisco idea, which I'm going to call geoeconomics, and we'll get to that in the last third of the walking tour and see how it's originated and how it's actually been embraced to one degree or another around the world. San Francisco's a study in contrast. For historic reasons, as I indicated, that coastal cities tend to be places where many cultures, and for commercial reasons chiefly, have come together. And for that reason, there's a lot to compare, and the comparison we're making is between those who have and those who have less. We're standing at a critical and decisive point in San Francisco right here, both literally as well as metaphorically. 4 blocks this direction is the second most powerful financial district in the United States because of high-tech and biotech investment capital. There's more venture capital coming through San Francisco than anywhere else in the country. 4 blocks this direction is City Hall. And for historic reasons, San Francisco's also home not just to local government, of course, but to state and federal agencies as well. The state Supreme Court is located here in San Francisco, for instance. In between is the poorest neighborhood in all of San Francisco, very arguably. It's the Tenderloin. This is where you'll see the most obvious poverty. You'll see people on the street, in the hallway, in the alcoves or doorways. Our first actual point of attention, though, is going to be the church, which is here on the corner. This is Glide Memorial Methodist Church. You may have seen the film that came out in 2006, Pursuit of Happiness, and it's situated here in San Francisco. It's based on a true story of an African-American man who's living on the street and works his way to being a millionaire by the end of the film. I actually detest the film because it's fun. At last, its message is that it's all an individual matter. Your success or your failure is really all about you and not whether society had some shortcoming, which is ironic because a good 1/10 of the film takes place in this church using social programs that are available, so it wasn't just an individual effort. Again, this is Glide Memorial Church, and as I will share the story, it begins in 1963 when the church, which seats about 500 people, had just 23 members remaining. They were all over 65 years of age. They were white, and it was apparent that the church would soon be shutting its doors if something dramatic didn't happen, and something dramatic did happen. The governing council of the church hired a dynamic young black man, a fellow named Cecil Williams, and within 3 years, the church then had 700 people attending services, and 2 services every Sunday. And as an amateur sociologist, I'm intrigued by, so what happened? How did he manage to this? What he did was begin serving the material needs of this neighborhood. So he developed the very first addiction programs for alcohol and drug abuse in the city. He also initiated a program of feeding the hungry. The church serves 750,000 meals a year. The building just this side of the church with the wavy top is one of 4 buildings, such buildings that were constructed and are maintained and operated by the church as halfway housing. That is, it's subsidized rent for those who have gone through the church programs but can't afford to live in San Francisco and need financial assistance. So my takeaway for you to consider on this tour is that a social movement, I'm considering this church to be a social movement where a large number of people have contributed the money that funds the social programs, have come together on account of very particular material objectives, not talking about the next life, but meeting needs that are here and present. A social movement must have, again, material product that is provided. It must be changing, in fact, the material life and not just speaking of an idealistic experience. This is an example of charity, however. It's not actually changing society, it's changing the individual, and that's a good thing. I'm not going to belittle that, but we're not going to talk about any more charity on this walk because I am not interested in simply patching over, but of transforming society. This walk is about that attempt. Whether it can achieve that or whether society actually achieves that is another matter, but here's an example of charity repairing or ameliorating, making better the experience of individuals, but not transforming society, except in the sense of bringing awareness, I suppose, to a large number of people to be mindful that there's those who are suffering. We head up the hill here for the next stop. Here we're talking about, I want to talk about one group, the Diggers. And this was a group that represents that second sort of social movement, that idealistic want to drop out. They don't want to transform society directly. That's not their intention. Their intention is to live free. Keyword, free. And how can we live in a world in which, how will we live in a world in which we make choices, free will choices about everything we do? This is very idealistic, but that was the ethos of this group, the Diggers, which themselves took their name from a British social movement of the 17th century. A faction, a large portion of the Protestants in England at this time, the 17th century, called themselves the Levelers. To level, they wanted to level the distance between the upper class and the middle class. They really weren't concerned about the peasant so much. There was a subgroup known as, they called themselves the True Levelers, but their more common name is the Diggers. And they took this name from digging in the earth. They argued that everyone should be a farmer. And why? Because theologically, God made the earth. To be in touch with God, too abstract unless you're farming. When you are farming, you're actually using God's earth. And everyone should be a farmer. And socially, this would result in equality. No one would be rich. If the king was also a farmer, he'd only eat what he produced on the land. They could share the food, but again, the king would have to work. This would, if there were a king, this would level society. And the Diggers here in San Francisco were inspired by this same group. They initiated the urban farming movement in the United States. The idea of going to an open parcel of land in a city that has no building on it and putting crops in the ground. Not to actually try to feed everybody, but they were demonstrating that underneath the sidewalk and underneath the street is God's earth. Now, these Diggers here in San Francisco were not Christians. They were just inspired by the social ambition of the Diggers. The way to be independent was to be self-sufficient. They were hypocritical in many ways. They're free. The way they got about being free was often by stealing. I mean, this was they didn't want. So it wasn't very consistent in their work. They also initiated, I guess you could say, the first free food program in San Francisco too. Food Not Bombs. You may have heard of this group, I don't know. In any event, the idea is you hand out food rather than promoting. This is an alternative to being war-minded, is to be giving-minded with food. And most of the work of the Diggers was conducted in the Haight-Ashbury district, about 3 kilometers from here, near Golden Gate Park. And they were serving 1,000 meals or so a day for about a half a year. Anyhow, this was their big deal, their big enterprise in 1966. Again, the reason I'm sharing this story is because a few of the diggers lived in this building for a short while during the early 60s. The diggers were interested in also rerouting a lot of the youth who were coming here. Between the ages of 16 and 22, there were thousands of kids arriving in San Francisco during the 60s because of its reputation as being a place to drop out, turn on, do something different, change your social behavior, come to San Francisco. And the diggers were interesting, they were idealistic, but they were also very practical. They recognized that there were not enough jobs here, there weren't enough programs to support these kids, and they thought this is just going to be a disaster for the city. So they began redirecting a lot of the youth to Northern California, where land was still very cheap, to form cooperative farms. And not many kids actually did that. Fewer still stayed, but this reputation, this ideal of you go to California and form a commune, a cooperative, captured the attention of many people, and even more people ended up arriving, so it backfired in a sense. Rather than sending more people away, it actually attracted even more folks. But nevertheless, this was one of the ideals of the diggers. And in pursuit of this, of their namesake, the diggers of the 1640s, who said be a farmer, and so this was their idea. Again, not theologically based, just as a practical, as they saw it, alternative to going to work in an office and doing a conventional sort of job. So my last story about the diggers has to do with their intention and objective, their goal of being culture jammers, to surprise culture and to startle people into thinking differently. My favorite anecdote in this regard was what they called the personal frame of reference. It was a 6 foot by 6 foot picture frame that was freestanding. It had legs, and they could set it up anywhere right on the sidewalk. And with downtown during the rush hour back in the 1960s, they would invite businessmen. Not that many people did this, but still, they were inviting businessmen to put down their briefcase, take off their jacket, their business jacket, and step through this personal frame of reference and be on the other side of possibility. And they didn't expect people to not go back through, but they wanted people just to have this lingering thought that I could have made a free choice. Because their argument was that most folk go to college because they're supposed to, most white folks go to college because they're supposed to get a professional degree, get married, and just have this track of their life, and then it ends here. And the diggers were saying, it could be anything. It's like a fantasy. Live in your fantasy and live this as an act of freedom. And if they could send the businessmen back into the office, scratching their head and wondering, but I could have done something else with my life. That was their goal, was simply to create discontent. Or if not discontent, just wonder at what might have been. So, hardly half a block from the Bohemian Club, I will be sharing the story of the Black Panthers, the most aggressive black liberation organization of the 60s into the 70s in the United States. And I'm sharing the story because a number of the Panthers lived in this building for a short while in the 60s. Most of the Panther work in San Francisco was in the Fillmore district, about 1.5 miles from here, 2 kilometers from here. But in fact, the Black Panthers had their origins in Oakland, across the water, which in the 1970s was about 45% African American. San Francisco, by contrast, is about 5% African American today, down from about 10 or 11% when I moved here in 1996. So it's been a declining and largely real estate related on that account. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale were the founders of the Black Panther Party. They met in college in Oakland and they founded a party for a very practical reason. In 1965, out of 500,000 elected office positions in the United States, only 500 of those seats were occupied by African Americans, and the goal of the party was to elect 5,000 African Americans to political office by 1970. They did not reach that goal, but they certainly turned some heads along the way. They met in college in Oakland in the early mid-60s. And They expected a little bit more to follow the fact that they had gone through college. But no, still being African American, they were second, third, fourth class citizens. And rather than simply be angry, not about their personal social challenge, but about the larger systemic concerns, they decided to create a party, literally a political party. Their first actions were conducted mostly by Huey Newton, who was a criminal justice major, which is in college, it's a degree program that often leads to somebody joining the police force. You become very familiar with, the whole point is to become familiar with the legal system and with constitutional law, both at the local level on up to the U.S. Constitution. He was very familiar with local law and constitutional law, so what he would do is, in his own car, follow an Oakland police car all night long, and when they would stop an African American, he would be there with his knowledge, with a tablet, a pen and paper to take notes, a camera, and so he was there to witness what was happening so that it did not escalate into a violent encounter for the African American man, or if it did, he was there to document what was going on. So this was active work to address profiling. And it came to be that about 6 or 7 of the Panthers were doing this on a nightly basis, were trailing the Oakland police. But there was something else they had in addition to the camera and the knowledge and the piece of paper and a pen, and that was a rifle. California was as liberal and even more liberal in terms of gun law than Texas in the 1960s. You could carry a rifle, and the Panthers purposely, aggressively carried a rifle in order to put the threat of violence as a mirror up to the police. If the police can carry a gun, the African Americans were saying, we're not going to be intimidated, we will carry a gun too, and it will be a rifle. So, and perfectly legal to do, and they would have it in their hands. The Panthers would have it in their hands when they got out of the car. And again, the idea was, you are not going to you the police, will not use the threat of violence without being reciprocated. We will show that right back to you. Perfectly constitutional and legal. So don't think as a police officer you're going to make us feel scared as African Americans. It's not going to happen. The Black Panther position on gun use was this: if the law says it's legal for whites to carry guns, the law applies for blacks too, and we will carry guns as well. We will mirror society. If society carries guns, we blacks will carry guns. And if the police can carry guns, we will carry guns. We will not initiate violence, but we will respond if violence is perpetrated against us. So it was very startling for white America to encounter not belligerent, but defiant active blacks. The real breakthrough, you might say, in terms of membership of the Black Panthers occurs in 1966, summertime, when 50 of the Black Panthers went to the state capitol and walked into the state capitol carrying rifles. Walked in, and this, as you might imagine, scared the ever-living daylights out of the assembly, the state assembly, the state politicians. Within 6 weeks, the law was changed. So it took something as defiant and as remarkable as stepping into the state house with guns to transform that. The gun law here in California. With that experience and with the news of this walking into the state capitol getting across the country, membership across the country began to rise very quickly in the Black Panthers, and so chapters opened up around the country, and then began the more day-to-day work, the real work that the Panthers, they weren't trying to gain attention for its own sake, except to grow the numbers of the group, but they really wanted to engage in community activity. And again, with the increase in numbers, there began the more day-to-day work, which included increasing access to housing opportunities, transportation, public transportation on the part of blacks, but also that included in a number of cities, and for a limited time, but operating an ambulance service serving black neighborhoods. The average time of response of an ambulance, and this is in the 1960s, to a white neighborhood was 5 minutes. In other words, you call the ambulance, within 5 minutes there's an ambulance there if you're in a white neighborhood. If you're in a black neighborhood, 40 minutes. And so the Black Panthers set out to counter that by creating their own ambulance service that would be in that neighborhood and would respond in a timely fashion. They also were addressing access to housing and to public transportation, same sorts of things that Martin Luther King was addressing, but again in a much, I guess you could say, a much more aggressive way, but also feeding hungry black kids. So there is still, I'd be surprised if this notion isn't still in the minds of many whites today, but it certainly was in the 1960s, that there, simply on the basis of race, there's a different intellectual ability between blacks and whites. The Black Panthers argued that it directly has something to do with, or indirectly has something to do with poverty. That is, blacks on average aren't able to eat as well. They're not actually earning enough income, and grocery stores are statistically less often found in poor neighborhoods here in the United States than they are in wealthier neighborhoods. And so to get fresh fruits and vegetables is literally more difficult to achieve in parts of Oakland than in San Francisco, say. Just because a grocery store says, where are we going to make our money? It's a market decision for them, is where's money going to be made? And the result is poorer nutrition. The Black Panthers initiated an early breakfast program to feed black kids, brown kids, and poor white kids for that matter, in neighborhoods, which became the model for the federal. Later it became the model, very ironically, for the federal program. I say very ironically because the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, listed the Black Panthers as the #1 terrorist organization in the country, and one of the arguments for so listing them was the early breakfast program. And you have to scratch your head and wonder, so what does early breakfast program have to do with terrorism? I can't make sense of it either, except in this respect, and this is not my original idea, but a friend of mine suggested that if you believe that you are superior to someone, and it can be demonstrated to you that your belief is a lie, that's an act of terror from your point of view. Because you're in this case, you're no different than a black. If you can be demonstrated that that's a difference, and that's in that sense, this early breakfast program demonstrated that it's poverty and not an innate characteristic of difference. Another real crisis, though, for the Black Panthers and for white America occurs because of the Vietnam War. In 1967, the Black Panthers challenged America, and when I say challenged America, that included Martin Luther King, not white America, but black America too, to face this matter of profiling. And the crisis story was the Vietnam War. So the Vietnam War during the Vietnam War there was what we call the draft. That's when young men at the age of 18, you have to sign up to join. There were ways to avoid the draft, and one of the ways to avoid the draft was to be enrolled full-time in college. Overwhelmingly, white boys were going to college. Overwhelmingly, black boys were not going to college. And when one looks at the death rate of American soldiers, again, I'm not minimizing the death of Vietnamese, but when looking at the death rate of American soldiers in Vietnam, it's clear that it was a race-based war. 20,000 of the 53,000 Americans killed in the Vietnam War were black. And the Black Panthers challenged America to say, and challenged Martin Luther King to publicly address the matter of how can you be in favor of nonviolence and not address American foreign policy. To his credit, Martin Luther King, after meeting with the Black Panthers, came out for the immediate and complete withdrawal of all U.S. forces from Vietnam. Now, he was already on board with that, but he hadn't gone public with it. But the Black Panthers made it a public issue, so he publicly was obliged to respond, and he did. The genius at this moment in time, 1969, for the Black Panthers was guided by Huey Newton, who connected white America with black America through this issue of the draft. He addressed white mothers chiefly, but white mothers and fathers too, and said, we as black, as the Black Panther Party, we will be on the very forefront of resisting the draft to preserve your kids if you will join us in working for black liberation. And a very small percentage, 10 to 15% of white American, progressive Americans, families, did just that. They actually did join with the Black Panthers in calling for greater liberties and opportunities for the black community in order to gain the alliance with the Black Panthers, who were on the forefront of resistance to the draft. When the draft ended in 1973, white America conveniently went back to its own suburbs, figuratively speaking and literally, and abandoned the black liberation movement. But nevertheless, in those intervening years, the Black Panthers went from being chiefly a black liberation organization to being a world liberation organization. And that fact is most notably crystallized in the fact that the only group of Americans invited to Maoist China were the Black Panthers. Mao Zedong invited the Black Panthers to Beijing, and they obliged. The takeaway from this stop about social movements, I would suggest, is they didn't use this phrase, but they were advocates for what I call security in geography. That's what every oppressed group, whether it's the gay community coming to San Francisco because security in geography compared with a part of the United States where there's fewer LGBTQ people who are open about that, this is where one would come to. Whatever the demographic that feels oppressed, they're searching for literally a place, a domain, a location where it's safe to be who they are. Referring back to the hippies, here's a mural that on Polk and Ellis. You may have seen this one in a parking lot. Yep. It's about 20 feet high, 30 feet across. 50th Summer of Love. So it's celebrating the 50th Summer of Love, or is it? Because love is crossed out and homeless has been written in above by the artist who created this. And here's a hippie girl. She's in blue, looking very Age of Aquarius. That won't mean anything to you, perhaps, but that was a very hippie-ish era phrase, was to be in the age of Aquarius when the world was going to be better, just because we have peace, love, and understanding. If we just love one another, the world will be better. Really? It doesn't turn out that way. There's still homelessness. That's what this mural is declaring. So we have governments in order to make things better than just living by the mantra of peace, love, I just love you and therefore I'll treat you good. Well, again, that doesn't work out. We can see that. So we need laws. But laws themselves are dependent upon revenue. If we don't have a police force that's funded, the police are going to walk off the job. Similarly, the fire department, similarly, the people who are paving the street and maintaining it. It's not going to get maintained if there's not revenue to do so. So we need to talk about taxes. I'm going to draw your attention to the building that looks old-timey. You will see that roof line, that roof design, everywhere in the world, but more than anywhere else you will see it in France and in Quebec province in Canada because of France, because of the French connection. Why is that? Well, it's for this reason. In the 18th century, France taxed buildings according to the number of floors. Not the size of the building, but the number of floors. And there was a technical detail of the law which specified that any portion of the building touching the roof would be exempt from that numeration. So, in other words, in this case, the top 2 or 3 floors, if there's 3 floors, would not be counted for tax purposes. This roof design emerged to avoid taxes. A fellow named Mansard came up with this roof design, and it's called a mansard roof. So today, people design it for aesthetic as an artistic choice, but originally it was for tax avoidance. At the same time in England, 1696 to 1803, there was a tax on windows. It was later adopted in France as well, but it was meant to be an easy way for the tax man to calculate the tax. How many windows? What's the average size of the windows? And there you have your calculation on tax. The result, though, was this: if you walk around London, you'll see big buildings with little windows, and you can impress whoever you're walking along with by saying that building went up in about 1750, and you'd be right because it's during the middle of that tax era. These buildings were constructed with little windows because with a little window you had a little tax. Many windows in London buildings were bricked up, that were larger windows were bricked up, and they're still bricked up today. No one's bothered to unbrick them. As a matter of fact, the expression in English, daylight robbery, which up until I did the research on this matter, I, as probably yourself too, believed was a reference to somebody who breaks into my home during daytime hours to steal something. No, it's a reference to the taxman literally stealing daylight from inside because of the little windows. The little windows are stealing daylight from the inhabitants of the building. One last example of what I'm trying to impress upon you is this. When you think of Amsterdam. What do you think of in terms of the design of buildings? Tall and thin, perhaps? Tall and why? Because in Holland in the past, buildings were not taxed on how high the buildings were, nor how deep the buildings were, only on what the frontage was. The narrower you built your structure, you could have it 1,000,000 miles high, but if it was 2 meters wide, that was your tax, was based on 2 meters. So the point here is that whatever is taxed, there tends to be less of that. There is only one thing in this world which I'm aware of, which, if it is taxed, there's more of that, not less. With everything else, if it is taxed, there tends to be less of that something. So, obviously, entering Chinatown, the unofficial official entryway is the archway. Chinatown in San Francisco is the third largest Asian community outside of Asia. There are 18,000 people in the next 8 blocks. It's the second densest neighborhood in the United States after Manhattan's Chinatown. Up until 1965, this was deep Chinatown, meaning it wasn't just Touristville the way it is today. This street, Grant Street, one street over is deep Chinatown today. Stockton. If you don't speak Mandarin or Cantonese, you're going to have difficulty conducting business. It will be hand signals for non-Chinese speakers. But up until 1965, this was very similar. And the reason it changed in 1965 is redlining was ended as legally as a behavior here in the United States. Redlining meant the practice by local government as well as by informally real estate agents of restricting access to different neighborhoods according to race. It was literally on the map. There would be a red line drawn in some instances by government agencies, in other instances secretly. But this is what's called redlining. That was ended, so that was ended. And at that point, the Chinese community was permitted to expand out of Chinatown. So the Chinese community is throughout San Francisco today. And this area is opened up to more Touristville for that reason, because of the population being able to spill over. The Chinese population in San Francisco represents about 33% of the population, 35%, so it's significant. That's all I'm going to say about Chinatown as such. There is a huge story to share with you that connects with Chinatown, and it begins with this signage right here. I've led this walk for 20 years. For the first 12 years, no one who read Chinese was on the walking tour, so I assumed it said, "Welcome to San Francisco's Chinatown." 12 years ago, I had a native speaker on the tour who said, "No, that's not what it's talking about at all." What it reads, first in poetic terms, and then in a more fluent translation, is, "Under sky, things connected." But in a fluent translation, it reads, "On earth, under sky, on earth, everyone is equal." On earth, everyone is equal. Or, alternatively, share things in common. And in little characters over here, it says Sun Yat-sen. And his name is actually Song Jiang, but the way it's written in the West is Sun Yat-sen, and that's how it's usually pronounced. The story I'm sharing here is the deep social justice legacy that exists for not just China, but certainly for China and for the rest of the world, that connects with Chinatown here in San Francisco. You've heard of Benjamin Franklin? Mm-hmm. Yes. You've heard of Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. You may have heard of Simón de Bolívar. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. All of these folks lived about 200 years ago
a little more than that. And they helped liberate, if you can call it that, and that's partly true, but those people I've mentioned helped liberate about 5 million people, no, including South America, about 35 million people 200 years ago. This fellow liberated 400 million people 100 years ago, and you haven't heard of him. Why is that? Well, it's not your fault, it's your educational system's fault. So who is this fellow? He was born in 1866, 1925 is when he dies. He was born in Canton in the southern near Hong Kong, in the southern part of China, and he had an elder brother who moved to the Hawaiian Islands in the 1870s. And the elder brother had the younger brother, Sen, come to Hawaii in order to get an education because there was no what we would recognize as a public education available until 1912. Through that education, Sen became familiar with Western-style political institutions, and specifically the American Constitution, but others as well, other Western constitutions. And he takes that information back to China and he says, wow, we could open up this country and really make it powerful and it would be dynamic for the people. And the emperor said, you've got 48 hours to be out of the country or you're dead, because I don't want to hear about this. So he goes to Japan for 10 years, Sen does, and spends 10 years there. He's now fluent in English, having studied at an American school. While in Japan, he reads a book written by a San Franciscan, a fellow named Henry George, who writes a book entitled Progress and Poverty. Sun Yat-sen reads this and he says, that's what's going to transform China. So he writes a book while here in exile. He was in San Francisco for a total of about 5 years, and while here he wrote the San Manchui, the 3 guiding principles of the people. 2 principles were simply, we need to unify the people into a collective whole, and secondly, we need a new constitution. The third was an economic program, and the centerpiece of the economic program were Henry George's ideas of we're going to socialize land value and use that to pay for college, we're going to use that to pay for streets, we're going to use that to pay for fire protection, we'll use that to subsidize housing if we want to do that. That will be the centerpiece. Here is the plaque marking the site of the first public schoolhouse in California, for that matter. Up until it was 1848, the building was erected in 1847, not the plaque. Up until 1880, the gender imbalance in California was 70-30, seven men for every 3 women. Why? Because it was a gold rush. It was a pioneer state. It was a place where crazies, that is men, came to. The women were smart. They stayed home and where life was good and better. But the men were looking for a quick way to make money. And why were they doing that? Because we can be confident no one would have done that unless they felt oppressed where they were. Just as the Europeans were leaving Europe to come to the United States to find, I would suggest, to find land as an opportunity. So Americans were finding that all the land on the East Coast was already owned by the Carnegies of the world, by the J.P. Mellons, by the Rockefellers of the world. And so they were coming west looking for their own opportunity. Nevertheless, first public schoolhouse opened here in 1848, which is my opportunity to introduce you to the woman I consider to be the most important school teacher in world history. And who might that be? Well, that would be Kate Kennedy. There was a Kate Kennedy preschool here in San Francisco, part of the public school system, still named for her. Why is she so wonderful? Well, follow this line. She established equal pay for women worldwide. The first time by law women were paid at the same rate as men was on account of this woman. So that's why in my book she's so important. But a little bit more about her. Interesting story. Born in 1827 in Ireland. Up until 1827, the English, who owned Ireland, had outlawed education. There was no equivalent to public education in Ireland. The concern was an educated Irishman will revolt. So we want to have an ignorant mass of farmers there. The primary product of Ireland at that time was, in fact, the potato. In 1845, a plant disease destroyed, as it turned out for the next 6 years, 50% of that crop. The problem for the Irish was that 3,000 Englishmen owned Ireland. If you were Irish and lived in Ireland, you had to pay the English to live in Ireland. And what you had to pay as rent was equivalent to everything produced in Ireland except 1/2 of the potato crop. So in 1845, when 1/2 of the potato crop died, the English landlords persisted in collecting one half of the potato crop and leaving the half that did not succeed for the Irish. 1 million men, women, and children died of starvation in Ireland between 1845 and 1851. So Kate Kennedy was part of the Irish migration to the United States on account of that circumstance. First coming to New York City and then stopping in San Francisco. She eventually went into education as a school teacher. She left her politics behind in Ireland. She had been a member of Young Ireland, which was the predecessor of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, the resistance to the English occupation. She had been a member of that, but she gave that up when she came to the United States until in 1871 she met Henry George. And with that encounter, she re-entered politics and in 1873 succeeded in putting through a law that gave women the same pay as men for equal work. First time in world history. In 1886, she was the first woman to run for public office. She ran for superintendent of public schools. She didn't expect to win, and she didn't, but she got enough votes that of the two other candidates, both of whom were men, the one who thought that her votes had cost him the election had her fired from her position in education. He was in a position to be able to do that. She sued the school district, and in 1890, having taken her case to the state Supreme Court, she was given her position back, her back pay, and that is the beginning of civil service tenure in the United States, is her work. So again, I credit her with being my favorite school teacher because, one, she was a Georgist, but what did she do with that information and knowledge? Equal pay for women, civil service tenure, and advocacy of reforming the land law of the United States. Henry George was a newspaper man who molds himself into being a social philosopher because as a newspaper fellow, he's in the business of reporting what he sees, and he's not out there to make money so much as he's asking himself a deep, soulful question. What does it mean, what I'm seeing, all this poverty that's emerging in San Francisco, which has always had poverty, but it's always had a very fluid social class. That is, somebody could strike it rich with gold and become wealthy, and the next day somebody who's very wealthy might be poor. It wasn't until after the gold rush that the shape of civilization that we're familiar with began to emerge. That is, the businessmen on top and the bankers up here. But prior to that, it really was very much a dynamic situation. And George had lived here since 1858. He came to San Francisco from Philadelphia in 1858. And he saw the last bits of the gold rush dynamic society where things could change. And he saw this emerging strata, and he was wondering, why is this? We've got the Industrial Revolution is producing so many goods. You can buy stuff that's made by machines rather than by hand. Really, I mean, it's hard for us as we stand here to really appreciate what the world looked like in 1840. In 1840, everything's made by hand. 1840 is really a big divide when factories begin producing most of the stuff that's consumed rather than it being made by hand. And George is looking at the world and saying, there's all this stuff being made. There's more than we can even buy. You could go into a grocery store today, everything's bought, and 2 days later the shelves are filled again. You could go into a hardware store. Everything could be purchased, and 2 days later it's filled. How does this happen? It's amazing. This did not exist 200 years ago. It was all made by hand, and you couldn't reproduce it that quickly. How is it possible that there's both progress and poverty? George is wondering. He's looking at why is it that with the industrialization of the West, and America in particular, why is it that despite plenty of everything, there's still the poor? Why does this persist? His goal was to answer the question of, specifically, why are wages so low that, for instance, the Marriott workers are on strike? Why aren't they getting enough? In 1877, he begins writing and completes by 1879 a book, Progress and Poverty. He wanted to start out with, who owns what anyhow? So he asked the question, what gives a person the right to say that this is mine and not yours, this is yours and not mine, this is ours, for instance, this park. His explanation for ownership was making something makes it yours. So for instance, using this hat, if it doesn't exist, I make it, it's now mine because I made it. You didn't make it, you didn't make it. Or alternatively, if I pay the person who made this hat and all the people who are associated with that, and I want the hat, it becomes mine because I've traded what I have made for what you've made, or what those people have made. It's reciprocity. And for George, reciprocity was sufficient. If there is reciprocity, there should be no poverty. That is, if people are exchanging goods and services for the value of goods and services, then there should be no injustice. Let's put it that way. And yet there's injustice. So George was saying, what's the matter? How else to explain this? Labor's giving and being paid for its labor. Capital should not be dominating. What's the problem? He then engaged in what he called a mind experiment. He looked over at a building such as this one, let's say, and in his equation, his math, he said, if the person who paid to have that building put up did so and paid everyone who had a part in it, there's reciprocity. There should be no problem. But there is a problem. So in his mind, he removed that part of the equation. He removed the building and asked himself, what is left? And what is left? Land. If making something makes it yours, who made land? Well, nobody. So who gets to own land? Who gets to own land is whoever has a bigger fist, or who gets there first. George is saying, how can there be justice if people are being constantly forced away from land? So he applied his making something makes it yours logic to an aspect of land to answer this question. This piece of land underneath that building, not the building, but the piece of land underneath that building here in San Francisco was worth a lot more than an equally sized piece of land out in the country. Why? More people are willing to give up their energy to be here. More people are willing, the Marriott workers, are willing to give up blood, sweat, and tears, energy, in order to be here rather than out in the countryside. So using the logic of making something makes it yours, to whom does the value of land belong? Society. The reason a piece of land has value isn't because a particular person owns it, it's because other people want it. That's why it has value. If only one person, the owner, wants it, it doesn't have any economic exchange value. So George argued that the value of land belongs to the community. He called for a single tax on the annual value of land. And so the value of that portion of that piece of real estate that's underneath the building would belong to society, its annual value. As a corollary, that is, as another part of his analysis, he said, did the building, since it was made by somebody, was that made by society? No. So its value belongs to the creator. So he called for no taxes on work, no taxes on business, no tax on people making or doing something. Only a tax on monopoly, on owning something that nobody made, but which has value because other people want it. His assertion is that what workers are doing and what hotel owners are doing is providing a good or a service. And a good or a service does not subtract from society. But when somebody says, this part of the earth is mine and you can't use it, that's a subtraction. And that's why that value has to be paid to society. In San Francisco, literally, this piece of land is probably worth at least $1,000 a year. Just this piece of land. In the world in the mind frame in which you live right now, you have been taught to believe, and you do believe, that if I own it and you want to stand here, you're going to pay me to be here. The way George looked at the world was, I have to pay you to stay off. You don't have to pay me to use this, I have to pay you to stay off, and that's my tax. And if I do that, the roads will be paid for out of this value, multiplied times all the land value of San Francisco. The homeless will be taken care of out of land value, not out of taxes on work, not out of taxes on business, but out of the value of land itself. And in that fashion, not just psychologically, but materially, social programs will be paid for out of the value of society, because the value of location is the value of society, the people, right? People are willing to pay to be here. That's the value of place. Same in Hamburg. You move that building out in the countryside in Germany to Hamburg and it's worth more. Is it because the building itself is worth more, or the location? It's the location. And this is George's argument, that location was not made by the owner, but it has value because of the presence of community. All the other buildings, the streets, the transportation system, the degree of education of the population and such. 80% of the value of real estate in San Francisco is in land. It's not in the buildings. But society doesn't collect that. Instead, it gives it to people like me. And it wonders, how are we going to pay for the homeless? It has to tax itself, because it's not taxing me for this piece of land that I own. It has to tax people who work. To see the cat is to see that there is a distinction to be made when speaking of human relationships, when speaking of something made by individuals or groups of individuals, and something made by the presence of community. For George, the proof that there is such a thing as community is that there is a price to land. Oh, incidentally, this piece of land is immediately across the street from the piece of land, not the building, rents for $48 million a year. It's the most valuable piece of San Francisco. Immediately across the street was a piece of land, smaller, and with a limit on how high it could go, because San Francisco building code says that you have to be able to see the cathedral from that intersection, so the building can't go up any higher than it is.
Oh, wow.
So, for that reason, this piece of land is worth less than if you said you could go up 20 stories, because you can't build as high, the land's not worth as much. But nevertheless, this land is immediately across the street from the most valuable piece of San Francisco. The question is, I put to you, how could a desirable piece of land be an empty space for 35 years? Why would a valuable piece of land be unused? The explanation is simple, actually. There are three ways to make a living in this world, and only three ways to make a living. You can do stuff, you can make stuff, and you can own the earth. Those are the only three ways to make a living. I'm a teacher, I don't make stuff, I just do stuff. Somebody else makes hydrants, makes sidewalks, makes automobiles, bicycles, what have you. You can do a combination of these, of course. That's another way to make a living. And the third way is to own a piece of land, get $48 million a year and rent it to somebody who's willing to put up a building, right? That's another way to do it. Each of those three categories, goods, services, and land, are taxed all around the world at about the same rate. Pretty similar. There are exceptions, but that's what they are, exceptions. Which of those three categories do you suppose is taxed at the lowest rate relative to the other two? Land. So if you are a major investor, do you invest in goods, services, or land? You invest in land, right? Because there's a low tax on it. It just makes sense. Money goes where it's going to be the least attacked, right? Investment. So that's in fact what Donald Trump does. The only piece of San Francisco that Donald Trump owns is this. He gets $48 million a year from San Franciscans, despite calling him misogynist, racist, a meanie, a baddie, stupid. Yes, it's the only piece of San Francisco. Yeah. At present, there's a small tax on the building and a smaller tax on land. Why was this piece of land still worth about $3 million a year, not developed? There was a $50,000 a year tax on it, so the owner made a decision to, rather than employ it, to keep it empty. Why was that? Speculation, waiting for its price to go up. Using the game of Monopoly to illustrate. Let's imagine that we are playing the game of Monopoly, and we agree before the game begins that none of us can build on this side of the game board. It's off limits. What does making this off limits do to the desirability, the price of the rest of the game board? That's what happens by not using desirable land, is it creates higher value of land before it naturally would go up. And the owner of this land does own other land, and saw an increase in income of over $500,000 in other land by not using this land. Now, that isn't to say that everybody who speculates in land makes money by doing so. But on average, yes, or this phenomena would not happen. Statistically, the underuse of desirable land results in fake scarcity. Not fake news, fake scarcity. That results in higher prices. So San Francisco and California, one reason it has high real estate values is because a lot of land is not being used. It's created scarcity. It was a choice.
Yeah.
It's a choice not to use it. That results in a number of things. One, if the price of land goes up, people have to pay more to live in San Francisco than they otherwise would. Two, if they don't want to pay that higher price, the only way they can afford to live here is to live in smaller space. So Chinatown is the second densest neighborhood in the United States. How many tall buildings are there in Chinatown? None. Where are the people living? 3 families to a 1-bedroom apartment. That's how they're doing it. I'm not saying that all is all over, but that's a lot of what's happening. And the other way that use of land results in is the price of land goes up, people have to pay more, or they live in smaller apartments, or the price of land, or people live out here. So they have to live further away from where they want to live. The Marriott workers, they have to live an hour and a half away from where they work. They can't afford to live here, and they're not willing to live in tiny apartments, say. They have a family, so that's not going to happen. So they live out here. What George proposed was a tax equal to the annual value of location. So again, this is worth about $3 million a year. The tax is $100,000 a year. If the tax were $3 million a year, the owner would maximize the use of this site. And it was unused for, as I say, 35 years. How it would have been built on immediately had the owner had no expectation of deriving any income from the location in the future. Another example is right here. This 5-story building has now been empty for 8 years.
Which one?
Yes. The tax on that building is $28,000 a year, but the site is worth $1 million a year. So George proposed $1 million tax. What would you do? You'd build up as quickly as you could, you'd fill it up, and instead of people being pushed out here, an hour and a half away from San Francisco, there'd be living space in San Francisco. And if there's more housing, what happens to the price of housing? It goes down, right?
Yep.
The more you produce of something, the lower its price eventually will become. Well, that's what George proposed. And no tax on the building owner. At present, we tax the person who builds it, and we tax the person who's in it, and we tax the person who maintains it. And George said, why would you penalize? Why would you tax somebody for producing the stuff you want? And why would you not tax the person who's keeping you from using the earth? The Marriott workers, all they're asking for is a little raise in their wages. They're not asking for the land underneath the Marriott Hotel. That's what they should be asking for. And they should be asking for the land underneath Donald Trump's building. But they're not. My standard, my gauge for social justice is black, lesbian, disabled. When a black, lesbian, disabled person says, justice is here, I believe it. I do not believe it when a white woman says it. I do not believe it when a Latino woman says it. I don't believe it when a white guy says it, for sure. I believe it when the most oppressed part of community says, and that's my estimate, is that's a black, lesbian, handicapped, says, it's good. I believe it's good at that point. But if in that moment that individual could say to another person, you still have to pay me to use this earth, there's not justice. As long as one person has to pay another person to use this earth, that's not justice. Not for the housing. I'm not speaking of paying for the housing, not paying for the goods and services, but paying to be on planet Earth, right? How much more wrong is it that, statistically speaking, every oppressed group in this country statistically pays white guys to live here? Statistically, white males own the surface of North America. So there can be no social justice so long as blacks, LGBTQ, Catholics are paying a white Protestant hetero to be here. It's crazy talk, right? So my question, the challenge I put to every demographic is, when are you going to ask for this earth to be yours? Because until it's yours, you can't win. It's impossible. I may give you the right to vote, but you still are paying me to be here, right? And I can say that as I represent the ownership of North America, a white hetero male. And again, I'm not saying that we alone are to blame, but why would anyone pay a white hetero male to actually live here, much less a black or a Latino woman or whatever? It's just crazy. So to relate this to social movement is just that. Social movement are misguided to the extent they're not asking this question. if they're only asking for the right to vote, if they're only asking for a little more housing, if they're only asking for breakfast, that guy asking for the money for breakfast, if that's all he wants, that's not social justice. Social justice is when I have to pay him to not be on my piece of San Francisco. And that payment will take the shape of streets. Payment for streets, that's the tax dollars, will pay for streets, will pay for social programs, will pay for transportation. Yep, on we go. There's fencing across the street, and that is there because there's an underground railroad, it's another story from what I've just shared, that's going into Chinatown. The rents in Chinatown, upon this project being announced, went up by 5%. And there were a slew of small businesses that went out because that 5% increase in rent was their profit margin. Other businesses went in, presumably believing that they would be more efficient, they could make an income. They're struggling too. The expectation is that when the two stations open, rents will go up another 5 to 7%, and more businesses will go out. I paid for this, and you paid for this project through taxes, and yet the real beneficiaries, if you just follow the money, are the landowners in Chinatown. What Henry George proposed was to tax away that land value as it increases, pay for this project through the rise in land values, and not tax the small business owners for having their small businesses and putting them out if they in fact are otherwise a going concern. But if it's simply that rise in rent that's now going to a private landowner, who's been served by our tax dollars? The landowner.